Welcome to the Sonlight webinar, Exploring Your Child's Learning Styles. We hope as we chat today that you will find some of the information that we share to be very practical and useful for you as you begin to consider home education as an option for your children. Joining me today are Kelly Lutman and Jill Evely. And ladies, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourselves? Kelly, maybe you can start first.
I'm Kelly. I live in the Gulf Coast state area, and I am a homeschool mom. Well, actually a graduated homeschool mom. I no longer am schooling my children actively, but we homeschooled for 19 years, and my youngest one graduated last year. And I still enjoy traveling to homeschool conventions and representing Sonlight, but also just encouraging homeschoolers as they get started.
Well, like Kelly, I travel to homeschool conventions to encourage homeschool parents too in my role for Sonlight, but I homeschooled for 17 years and I have 5 children. And like Kelly, I'm a graduated homeschool mom too. My youngest child graduated 3 years ago.
Thanks, ladies. Well, my name is Judy, and I have not yet achieved the status of graduated homeschool mom, so I look up to these ladies. I am a mom of 3 kids, one of whom is a sophomore in college and 2 are in high school. And like Jill and Kelly, I also travel to conventions here in the Northeast to share Sonlight with folks and to hopefully encourage homeschooling moms, which is a passion of mine as well. Okay, ladies, now that we've introduced ourselves, how about we go ahead and get started and share a little bit about learning styles?
I would imagine those that have joined us on this webinar are wondering what are learning styles and why should I care about learning styles. And when I was in school, no one ever talked to me about those.
True.
But it's because we're discovering that there's a niche for each student and a particular way that they are bent or designed, and each one does not learn in the same way. And so the benefits of beginning your homeschooling career by studying your children and figuring their learning styles out is you can choose your curriculum better. Not every curriculum is designed the same way. Some are very interactive, some are very visual, some are just geared for different children. And so you don't want to take the thing that you were necessarily accustomed to as a child yourself in your education days and assume it's going to be the right fit for your child. Likewise, knowing about learning styles helps you become a more effective teacher. You're not going to be beating your head against the wall because you're trying to approach it one way and it just doesn't seem to be sinking in. So you find, if it's not working, there's something that needs adjustment. And you can make adjustments using learning style, but yes, head off that frustration. Be proactive. And if you're finding something's not working, one of the wonderful joys of homeschooling is you can change it. You don't have to enact a law with your school board or anything like that to adjust things in a classroom because you're in charge. And so you have the ability to make changes as you go.
Kelly, that is so true. When I first started homeschooling, one of the first books I read was a book by this lady that we've quoted here, Cynthia Tobias, in her book, The Way They Learn. And I remember being so amazed at all the different learning styles that were out there and just being able to categorize my kids and being so thankful that I knew about that before I started homeschooling instead of, like you said, getting frustrated and then going back and trying to figure it out later.
Right, and you can really work with your child or your children in a more effective way so that it really makes homeschool more rewarding all the way around for everybody, the student and the teacher. I mean, both.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's another thing that we need to point out is that homeschooling is not just academic. It's academics and relationships because you are still a family. You are still working with your children, and they are working with you. And I think that's an aspect that sometimes gets overlooked when people are considering homeschooling or actually doing it themselves. They forget that relationship aspect. And I've had some people think that homeschooling won't work because one of their children just seems to march to the beat of a different drummer. And they think there is no way I could spend all day trying to teach this child. It's enough to try to get them out the door and get them started in the morning. And you just might think that it's not going to work for you. But realize that the other side of that equation is your parent and the relationship you have. You've got a choice of either detaching from that child emotionally or cultivating that closeness by pursuing them and becoming a student of the child to learn what is it that makes them different. Just because it's a different beat doesn't mean it's wrong. What is it that makes them unique and different, and come alongside them and find a new way to approach your academic pursuits. That way, you can not only build the academics, but also the relationship, and they don't feel like you're constantly working against them. Likewise, you don't feel like they're against you.
It would be hard to find a family where you didn't have one child that marched to the beat of a different drummer.
True.
I think that we all, or most of us, probably have that, and maybe we don't talk about it, and maybe people don't realize it, but that's something that pretty much most families face, I think, and it can be very draining if you're going to work against the style of that child. So it really is nice if you know their style and kind of work with it, because it makes just for a nicer day, and it just works better all the way around.
Exactly.
And in the long run, I think you preserve a relationship with that child.
Yeah.
I can think specifically of one of mine who beats to a drummer that I just don't even recognize. But, learning to come alongside of that child and beginning to understand how they learn and how they view life has done so much to add to our relationship that I would not trade it for the world.
It stretches
very
us,
much so.
It's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing
No,
at
it's
all.
not. Yep.
I think we all have recognized that, our children are different, as we've already mentioned, and I think every one of my children has a different beat, which can make life really interesting. But we all recognized very early, from the point of raising them into toddlerhood and coming from beyond that each child approaches life differently. You do have the very quiet, reserved ones, but you've got the ones that burst into the room and say, "Ta-da, I'm here. What you going to do now?" And you've spent those years with your children learning them, but also learning what their likes and their dislikes and their motivations are. Not every child is motivated by an M&M or a piece of candy or a sticker, or each of them has a different type of motivation as well. And so we've learned that from their youngest years. Why would it be any different to apply that in school time? When we know their strengths and their weaknesses, then we can take that information and incorporate it into education as well, so that we can equip them to be successful in whatever they pursue after education. Some situations may require you to do a task in a certain way, and you may say, okay, you've got to do it Mom's way or not at all. But there's so many other tasks around the home in life that can be approached from a different angle and still be accomplished with success. And so we just need to begin to decide that my way isn't always the best, and what might be a different approach that my child can take that would reach the same goal.
Kelly, I think for me this is one of the greatest benefits of homeschooling, because in a classroom setting it would drive a teacher nuts to have to try to tweak and manipulate her teaching approach and her materials to meet the learning styles of 20 or 15 or 35 students, however many she might have or he might have. But I think in a homeschooling one-on-one situation, even if you're dealing with multiple children, you have a much better opportunity to bend their learning experience to really meet their unique need.
I think that's really true, Judy. And I know also that, one of my kids really is more of an independent worker, and I was more the let's gather the kids together on the couch and let's read and talk about, discuss, and do things together. And it just didn't really work very well for him, and sometimes he caused trouble and was a little bit irritating. I'll put it mildly, a little bit irritating, doing it my way. And when I actually sat down and talked to him and we worked it out and found out that really he just was frustrated because he felt like he could get a lot more done if he didn't have to sit and have all these discussions all the time. And I know that he still needed to, be able to talk to people and socialize and those type of things, be able to get along in the family. But I found when I let him work a little more independently when I gave him a little schedule and he could follow it and do his work, and then we could talk about it later and just come together some of the times, he worked so much better. He learned better. He achieved more success, and it was very humbling to think that I was actually hindering the way he learned, because I wanted him to do it my way instead of being able to compromise a little bit and do some of it my way, but do some of it his way. And it just was a real eye-opening experience.
I bet it was.
Yeah.
And those who have joined us considering the homeschool trek and wondering if this is something that would be working for them, they may very well be considering homeschooling because their child is currently in a traditional classroom setting and may describe him or her as one who hates school or finds it boring or is just not making progress, and it's obvious that it's not working where they are now. And so these parents are looking for a new approach. But the good news is, and this is vital to understand, it's not that the child hates learning or is unable to learn. They probably are being forced to fit into a mold that just doesn't fit them, like Jill's son, who could sit around and join the discussions and the group time, but meanwhile he's thinking, I could be doing so much more if I was just allowed to follow a schedule separately. And likewise, if a child is shoved into a mold when they're a round sort and they're put into that square peg area, it just doesn't fit, and there's a lot of gaps and a lot of spaces lost because of it.
And I think that is probably one of the biggest things that I hear when I talk to folks who are considering homeschooling is, they describe to me how their child just is so bored and they just come home every day in tears, or they're frustrated, or they're getting into trouble, and they're just at a loss. If the school can't help them, then how can I possibly help them? And very often when we head down this path in our discussion about learning styles, you will see the light bulb suddenly go on over their head and understanding go on in their eyes. And when they realize that they do not have a stupid child, they don't have an unintelligent child, they don't have a troublemaker child, they just have a child who's been forced into a mold that doesn't fit, like you said, Kelly.
Right. So we've talked about learning styles. We've talked about considering our child's learning styles. And some people are saying, well, that's all fine and dandy, but what in the world is learning styles? And it's really a subjective topic. It's not a clean definition. There's no specific, very academic-sounding definition to learning style. But the whole idea is each of us is unique in our approach. And because of the uniqueness, it can be difficult to categorize one person and another into a clean group. You do it this way, and you do it that way, and this other person does it this way. Sometimes there's a little bit of intermingling and kind of a fuzzy border between the groups. Mm-hmm. But in general, if we focus, first of all, on learning modalities in our planning approach, we discover that learning modalities are classified as visual or kinesthetic or auditory. So if we look at just those three classifications at first, there's other depths you can go into in exploring other learning styles. But if we start with those three, it's enough to be able to handle as you begin considering each child and looking at where they might fit. Of course, the visual child, you assume it's going to have visual clues. It's a child that learns very well from things that they see. And this usually is the focus of the traditional textbook or workbook. It's got color, it's got pictures, it's got writing, it's been formatted in an interesting way, but it's all to draw in the visual learner. It may incorporate maps and diagrams and pictures and charts. The visual person is really good at reading a map or evaluating information out of a diagram or picture, a chart. And visual learners do appreciate the opportunity to draw or paint. In fact, often a visual learner will doodle on their paper while they are hearing teaching if they're not seeing something visual. If they're just getting a lecture and the person doesn't look any different from 1 minute to the next, then they may doodle information to reinforce what they're learning in a visual way. Flashcards are wonderful for visual learners because they can see the problem, whether it's addition or subtraction or maybe vowel or phonic flashcards, a variety of ways. They see the representation, and then they can lock in the information and answer. But on the other side, clutter is a difficulty for a visual learner. For a visual learner to sit down at a messy desk is very difficult because they're distracted by the mess. And they're wondering, oh, what's this about? And, oh, what's that? And maybe I should move this, and maybe I should go play with that. And so it's very hard for them to focus on their education, on their studies, on reading or whatever, if they've got a lot of other visual distractions around them. So you need to think visually when you're looking at this particular child and the learning modality.
And boy, was this ever our firstborn child. I started schooling her, and I thought, wow, this is going to be easy. She really gets into these workbooks, and she loves flashcards, and all of those things said school to me, having had a public school background. But as we got going into the school year, I could not figure out why she couldn't get her schoolwork done. And as I began to pay attention to what was going on with her, and I was talking to a friend who was sort of my mentor, she was a few years down the road in homeschooling from me, one of the things she recommended to me was look at what's going on around her. And just like you mentioned, Kelly, we often did our seat work at the dining room table, big picture window in the dining room. We had kind of like an open floor plan so you could see from the dining room into the other rooms in the house. And when I just stepped back and watched her, her eyes were everywhere except on her workbook or her work. And so one of the things I did, we happened to have to replace our refrigerator, and I took that big refrigerator box and I made her a cubicle. And I set that refrigerator box up on the table, and she worked inside her little office cubicle. And within a couple of days, she was getting her schoolwork done on schedule with no problem at all, and it was such a simple fix. And so sometimes just very practical things like that will make the difference for a visual learner.
The next modality we have is kinesthetic, and it's kind of a fancy word for doing and moving, the movers and shakers in our lives. As a preschooler, you often see kinesthetic nature just because preschoolers handle their environment. So you can use ideas from the kinesthetic learning modality until you see other modalities begin to take shape as your child grows older. But, of course, drawing and quiet activities can occupy their hands while their ears need to be tuned in to what you're reading or speaking to them. I found very quickly when we were reading books aloud, if I had a busy child, that child needed something to occupy their hands while they listened. And it was amazing how much they could hear when it seemed like they were busy doing something else. But it just released them to get that activity out through their hands, and their ears were still very nicely tuned in. I was amazed when we started playing with that aspect. They also enjoy multisensory reading and writing activities, maybe incorporating some reading and then follow it with writing activities, or doing things on a board in a large scale instead of making it very small. Spelling and math practice can be done on a large whiteboard because large movement with the hand is more kinesthetic than small, tiny writing on a piece of paper. And they can incorporate that very well. The whole key, though, is movement while they're learning. Don't require the kinesthetic child to sit still in a chair for very long. That's torture for them. They need to change locations. They need to be able to move. In fact, we have the rocking chair picture here because one of the things that Cynthia Tobias pointed out is the kinesthetic child can tune in very well with their ears if they are rocking or moving their body. And so if you want to have a good discussion with a kinesthetic child, put that child in a rocker. And they can move, but they can still tune in and focus in on your discussion. It really frees them up to be able to move around, changing locations. Even one of my boys used to do math regularly at the kitchen counter because he could stand and do math much easier than he could sit still and do math at the table. So we just changed around.
I think one of the things that I learned from with my kinesthetic learners, and that I learned really from the Cynthia Tobias book, was that it's not even just that if they're moving, it frees them up to listen, which is part of it. But when they're sitting still, it's like they're saying to themselves, and I could see it in my own boys, they're saying to themselves, I'm sitting still, I'm sitting still, I'm sitting still, and they're concentrating so hard still that when I say, okay, so what did I just say? And they look at you with this really blank look, and they're like, well, I mean, I don't know, I was sitting still. It's like they have no comprehension of how to listen to what you're saying because they're just all their focus is on sitting still. And once I realized that, because I have some wiggly boys that turned into kind of wiggly men, some of them, once I realized that, it made a world of difference. I don't get so frustrated when they're, tossing the remote control up and down, up and down, up and down when they're watching TV, because it's part of who they are and part of how they learn, and they don't even know they're doing it. So I think that's just so critical, Kelly, what you said here about the movement, the changing locations, and not making them sit still. If you really want the kinesthetic child to learn and hear and understand and engage, they've got to be moving or doing something else besides just sitting still.
Right.
And I think
you can see how this doesn't fit in a classroom very well.
It doesn't fit in a classroom at all, no. No.
You can't have an ant pile, constantly movement and action through the classroom, and so it's very difficult for a classroom teacher. But if you've got one or two like that at home, you can adapt and work with it in your home, and that can be such freedom for your child if they've just been stuck in a desk.
A good thing to remind folks that it's okay to change up locations.
Yes.
If your child needs to lay on the floor under the table on their belly to learn their math, it's okay. There's nothing illegal or wrong about that. If they learn math better standing on their head, then they need to do that. There is no book. Nobody's going to come and check, in your house and say, well, that math didn't count because he was standing on his head. It's really okay to adjust based on their learning styles.
And what you accommodate young is not necessarily going to be the way they do it forever. But while they're young, if they can set those patterns, and, by college they probably aren't going to be laying under the desk. But, but initially it's not a battle you need to fight.
But they still might need to chew gum, or they might need to have a stress ball, or they might need to, tap their foot. I mean, I've got college kids that they really still needed to movement, but they could do it in a more socially appropriate manner.
Right. Yes.
With the chewing gum, with the stress ball, with the fiddling, or just different things that they would do, because they still seemed like they still had to keep moving, but just not quite so full body movement like a younger child.
That's very true. Well, the third learning modality that we have is auditory. And again, this one's fairly self-explanatory. The auditory child learns from verbal instruction or hearing things. And the key with this one is talk with that child. Give them opportunity to talk to you, and you talk with them. Discuss things, point things out, ask them questions, just constantly talk. We do this for our little ones very commonly when they are learning to talk. Why stop once they've learned to talk? Let's keep it going and just begin to learn to carry on a pattern of conversation for them, and it will help them go along much better if they are an auditory learner. You also can have the child read out loud a lot. In fact, often auditory learners learn best when they are doing the talking. So if they are trying to learn information, you could even have them record speaking the information into a CD player or something and record it, and then have it played back to them. And if it's in their own voice, it helps to key the memory better. They can do narration, and narration is simply tell me what you read in this story, or tell me what I just read to you in the story. Can you tell Dad what we're reading in this story? And the whole idea is for them to then turn around and verbalize the flow of the story and the characters involved, and it helps to lock in the comprehension and the memory for them. But again, it's an auditory method. Books on tape are another great way for the child. Now, I would encourage that you have them listen to the book on tape, but if you have the printed book and they watch and follow along as they listen, that's all the better, because then they're getting multisensory approach to that learning. But another one is playing memory games. They can talk through their process. If you watch game shows, you'll often see the participants working through their choices and saying, no, that one doesn't work because of this, and this one doesn't work, and this is a possibility, but maybe this one is the right answer. Have them do the same type of thing as you're thinking about your memory games. I remember this one was this, and this one was that, and I think it might be here, but let them talk through their process out loud so that they are learning and cueing in that auditory nature for themselves.
I found with one of my students that was this type of learner that also if I kept the lessons very short so that they could get their questions answered in between, it seemed like if we went on a longer lesson, maybe teaching them something, and then they would be thinking about then their question, and they'd be thinking about that in their head, and then they wouldn't be listening to the rest of it. Stop them often, because they always want to talk and they always want to participate. So if you could stop often and have your lessons more in short bursts, it seems like then they could get their question answered, say what they thought about it. You know, they always have to give their opinion, and then you could move on to the next thing. And it seemed like that made the lessons more productive.
Good idea. Good point. Yeah. Very good. So having the outline of these 3 learning modalities, if you keep them in mind as you choose your homeschool curriculum or you begin to plan your school year or even getting your home ready for schooling, if you need to have an area where that won't be so cluttered for a visual learner, or you need to be able to facilitate rocking for a kinesthetic learner, keep those learning styles in mind as you do these aspects of preparing to homeschool, and you'll be much more successful when you actually get started in it.
And
another thing that you need to do, go ahead, Jill.
I was going to say, I think, too, if you can listen to your child and really just ask them. If they're having trouble learning or having trouble with some kind of something in your school, just say, what is the problem, or where do you think the problem lies, or how can we make this work better, and just talk to them like I did with Chad and find out what they find objectionable. And sometimes you're like, oh yeah, I forgot that this other way might work because I wasn't thinking about their learning style. And just talking and listening to them, a lot of times you can solve problems if you just want to work through with them and keep the lines of communication open.
Very true. Another thing that I found is key is when you're looking to choose homeschool curriculum, mom needs to have in mind her own learning modality and note whether it matches her children or not. Because as you go shopping through a vendor hall at a homeschool convention or you begin to look at things in catalogs, you will be drawn to what matches your learning style first. And you need to be careful to keep in mind the learning modality of your child so that you're choosing for them and not just for you. The quote that we have on the screen by Cynthia Tobias is really good. Jill, you were excited about that quote and wanted to share it with us.
Because it reminded me a lot of my child that I said wanted to work more independently and was just geared that much more way instead of making him go my way. Because she says, instead of spending so much time and effort trying to convince our children to move in the path we've designed, which is exactly what I was doing, we could encourage them to get to their destination by allowing them a few minor detours. And I love that because it isn't like you're throwing your whole plan out the door and you're saying, oh, I'm just going to revolve everything around this child, but it's taking into consideration their needs and making some detours, but maybe not changing the whole, travel plans, just making a few detours for them along the way. I love that.
Well, you think about it. Detours get you to the same destination. They just take you a different route.
Yeah. You see different
and
things.
Probably make
different things.
And detours probably make the trip a little more interesting along the way.
Yeah, that's true.
True. Very true. Very true.
But I think all children, though, can really benefit from all various types of styles. I mean, we aren't saying, I guess I want to make sure that people don't hear us say that if I have a kinesthetic learner, I have to do everything for them kinesthetic, and they can't do any other style. All children could have some styles, and all can benefit from all styles.
True. Good point.
You need to let them focus in certain areas, especially for subjects that are harder for them. You'd want to focus that learning modality to match them. But you're right, and each of the three of us has children that represent these different modalities, but we've all used Sonlight effectively with any of those three children's modalities. You know, we've been able to adapt our reading, to adapt our approach of the program by changing how we use it, where we use it, you know, what we do in the process of reading the books and discussing them, so that it's worked with all of our children's different learning approaches and been successful at that.
Yes.
Very good point.
So we've mentioned a resource frequently already by Cynthia Tobias, a book called The Way They Learn, and this is available from Sonlight. I highly recommend this as preliminary reading for a homeschool mom or someone who's considering homeschooling, because she just helps you get outside of the box of our traditional education. I love her favorite phrase is, "What's the point? Why have we always done it this way? Will we accomplish it in another way? If so, isn't that the goal, is accomplishment, not necessarily how we get it done?" She just is very, very practical in her approach to things.
And her writing technique, too, it isn't overly technical. It's not a huge book. It's a pretty quick read that you can get through and have a lot better idea of how to get started teaching your children and relationships with your children without spending, you know, weeks or months, you know, getting yourself through a really thick or just hard to read book. You know, her writing style is very pleasant.
Yeah, and she's incredibly funny. I remember laughing my way through that book every time I read it.
Because you could think of all the different people that you knew.
Exactly.
She was giving, and it just made you laugh out loud. I felt the same way.
Very, very much so. And then several years into our homeschooling, I discovered Different Children, Different Needs by Dr. Charles Boyd, and that kind of took me a little step deeper. He talks more from personality styles, but in very beneficial way, he teaches how to identify your child's personality, but also your own, and how you would interact with another child's personality based on what your personality is. That really helped me with my youngest one, because he was the different drummer kid. And I was having trouble as he got older, feeling like I was connecting with him. And using Dr. Charles Boyd's materials and reading, it was like, oh, that's what I need to do. You know, the light goes on. Isn't it fun? So these resources, Dr. Boyd's book is not available through Sonlight, but you can find it at general bookstores or through Amazon online. If you just did a search for the book, I'm sure it would be easy to find.
Great. Well, ladies, this has been an often, as usual, we always seem to enjoy getting together and hashing over topics, and hopefully those who have opportunity to listen in will be able to take away just a lot of really practical information as they are considering the homeschooling option for their children. So, ladies, thanks again for an awesome time this afternoon, and I look forward to chatting with you again.
Thanks, Judy.
We'll do it soon. Thank you.
Bye.